Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Claudia Brittenham, Director of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Chicago and Associate Professor of Art History here at this university. Today, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Martín Vega, who is Assistant Professor of Spanish, Latin American, and Caribbean Literatures and Cultures at Scripps College. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan, and his research focuses on the indigenous literatures and cultures of the Americas, particularly Central Mexico, with a particular interest around the intersections of race and gender during and after the European invasion and conquest. He's working on such a fascinating range of projects, including color vocabularies in 16th century Mexico. There's an article that's just coming out, the status of indigenous women governors in the passage to colonial Mexican society, and the uses and abuses of maguey in the 17th century. But today he's going to talk to us about Justicia and intercultural translation in the Nahuatl writings of Chimalpahin. I think we all need to think about a little bit of justice right now. Thank you so much, Martín.
Thank you, Professor Brittenham. It's a pleasure to be presenting today through this lunchtime series hosted by the University of Chicago. Thank you, Claudia, or Professor Brittenham, for the invitation to present today and to share a bit of my work on the idea of justice in the writings of Chimalpahin Quauhtlehuanitzin. And thank you, everyone, for being in attendance today. And I'll look forward to any questions or comments after this presentation. So in this talk, I will discuss the use of the loanword Justicia in the Nahuatl writings of Chimalpahin Quauhtlehuanitzin, who is known for being the most prolific Nahua historian during Mexico's colonial period. When I say Nahua, I refer to the dominant linguistic community in central Mexico at the time of the Spanish arrival in the 16th century. Included in this community are the Mexica, popularly known as the Aztecs, whose capital city rested on an island in Lake Texcoco in the Valley of Mexico. And of course, the Mexica capital, Tenochtitlan, would then become Mexico City and the governing center of New Spain. Chimalpahin was not himself Mexica, but rather a citizen of a neighboring alphabetic, or city-state, at the southeastern edge of the Valley of Mexico called Amacameca, part of the larger province of Chalco. Scholars of pre-Hispanic and colonial Mexico have drawn on various Spanish, Mestizo, and indigenous histories from the first century of Spanish colonial rule in Mexico, or what we may call the long 16th century, to shed light both on pre-Hispanic legal systems and indigenous adaptations to a colonial legal regime based on Spanish institutions that were transposed to the Americas. Works by authors such as the Mestizo Fernando de Alba Ixtlilxochitl and Spanish priests such as the Friar Diego Duran have provided important details about the nature of pre-Hispanic law and jurisprudence, particularly in the province of Texcoco. Meanwhile, analyses of indigenous legal documents in the colonial period show the implementation of Spanish legal institutions in central Mexico and how they altered indigenous society and how indigenous people used the new legal system to seek redress against the various injustices they incurred both within their own communities and within the larger colonial society. I propose that Chimalpahin's Nahuatl writings operate between the rhetorical modes of historical discourse and juridical critique aimed at helping the indigenous population, or Macehualtin in Nahuatl, to better understand and respond to Spanish methods of governance. I argue that though Chimalpahin had an ample understanding, an ample range of Nahuatl vocabulary to express Spanish concepts of governance, he nonetheless used Spanish loanwords as an exercise in intercultural translation. That is, the translation not just of words, but of entire social systems, concepts. Key to this exercise is the incorporation of the Spanish loanword justicia and closely related terms into his otherwise Nahuatl prose. In what follows, I will provide some biographical and historical context before moving to a close analysis of Chimalpahin's historical writings. The limited knowledge we have about Chimalpahin's life primarily comes from his own writings, and his work as a scholar and scribe coincides with his residence at the small church of San Antonio Abad in Mexico City between 1593 and 1631. though the first published record of Chimalpahin's manuscripts dates to the late 18th century, it is only very recently, since the 1990s, with the works of Susan Schroeder, Rafael Tena, and others, that these manuscripts have been comprehensively transcribed, translated into English and Spanish, and made generally available in published form. More recently, Camilla Townsend and David Tavares have filled in a fuller picture of Chimalpahin's life than had been previously available. To provide some basic details here, Chimalpahin, as he is popularly known today, is short for Domingo Francisco de San Anton Muñón Chimalpahin Quauhtlehuanitzin, a name that combines Chimalpahin's various corporate Christian affiliations and the names of his ancestors, indigenous ancestors. He was born in May of 1579, spent his youth in Amacameca, and in 1591 was sent to Mexico City. In 1593, at age 14, he joined the Church of San Antonio Abad, and in 1594 he became a mayoral, or manager of the church, a job that made him responsible for the church's indigenous parishioners. In the early stages of his career as a scribe, he primarily kept record of events as they occurred and that he observed in Mexico City. Then, from 1608 to 1624, his focus shifted to writing down the long political history of Amacameca and the Valley of Mexico from about the 12th century to the early 17th century. For this historical work, Chimalpahin relied on his recollection of stories that he had heard in his youth and on books that had been kept within his family. In terms of social status, Camilla Townsend states that Chimalpahin was a member of the lesser nobility of Amacameca, and that he traced his lineage to the Tlatocapili, or kingly noblemen, who were the closest relatives of kings, who were called Tlatoque in Nahuatl. Susan Schroeder describes Chimalpahin as essentially the family scribe or the keeper of the trust, while Camilla Townsend points to the loss of indigenous life and large-scale changes in the Valley of Mexico as motivation for Chimalpahin's written work, which he produced in an alphabetic prose Nahuatl that Spanish missionaries and their indigenous collaborators had created in the first few decades of the Spanish colonial occupation of central Mexico. Prior to Spanish colonization, the various Mesoamerican writing systems were visual in character. They consisted of logographs, syllabic glyphs, and pictographs that were painted or etched onto surfaces such as maguey fiber paper, deer skins, and stone monuments. Writers in this context were thus also painters, and this dual character is captured in the Nahuatl word for scribe, tlacuilo. Recently, Barbara Mundy has written on the indigenous transition from tlacuilo to escribano, the Spanish term for notary, in 16th century Mexico. She focuses specifically on a set of documents produced between 1553 and 1572 by the indigenous Cabildo, or town council, of Mexico Tenochtitlan. Mundy observes that these documents appear as full folios or pages with each page consisting of a pictographic map on the left side and alphabetic Nahuatl language text on the right. According to Mundy, these documents were designed to ratify indigenous landholders, to quote, ratify indigenous landholders' possession of property by the indigenous Cabildo of Mexico Tenochtitlan, often in the wake of a sale, end quote. Mundy's analysis of these documents is important for elucidating how writing among the Nahua shifted from pictography to alphabetic text in the first century of Spanish colonial rule. As Mundy states, the reasons for why this shift occurred have been easier for scholars to ascertain. We know that linguistic training was critical to the work of the mendicant friars, whose duty it was to evangelize the indigenous populations of Mexico. These missionaries took as their task the creation of an alphabetic Nahuatl script based on extensive study of Nahuatl grammar and spoken conventions. This work was effectively done in the first 4 decades of Spanish colonial rule. Concurrently, the implementation of Spanish governance in central Mexico involved the creation of a legal system adapted to the local situation, including the predominance of Nahuatl as the lingua franca of the former Mexica Empire. The development of alphabetic Nahuatl writing dovetailed with the legal system imported from Spain that placed particular value on the written word as carrier of evidentiary truth and judicial authority. In essence, the force of law had to be backed by the written word, which entailed a specialized class of scribes, or escribanos. Mundy notes that while the official title of escribano was off limits to indigenous persons in colonial Mexico, The relative autonomy of local indigenous governments allowed indigenous scribes to unofficially assume that title anyway. One more important factor in the shift from indigenous pictographic writing to alphabetic Nahuatl in central Mexico was the censorship of indigenous visual culture, which drew increasing suspicion from colonial authorities who feared the reemergence of indigenous Mesoamerican religion. During the period in which alphabetic Nahuatl was invented, a concurrent project involved the production of painted manuscripts modeled on the pre-Hispanic manuscripts that had been largely destroyed by Spanish missionaries in the early years of Spanish colonization. The Codex Borgia is one example of the rare Central American documents that survived the Spanish invasion of Mexico. Along with alphabetic Nahuatl, the new painted manuscripts were intended to assist missionaries in learning about native Mesoamerican religion in order to replace it with Christian doctrine. The Codex Mendoza, the Codex Borbonicus, and the Codex Telleriano Remensis are examples of these new manuscripts, which often included supplemental text in Spanish. By the end of the 16th century, the production of such manuscripts had been halted, and the manuscripts themselves were confiscated by Spanish authorities and sent overseas, ending up in various libraries and private collections across Europe. The censorship of indigenous pictographic writing thus coincided with the establishment of a colonial legal apparatus that at the local level required a class of unofficial native escribanos. In this context, Chimalpahin enters the scene. By the time Chimalpahin began his training as a scribe, the possibility for the way he could write had been circumscribed by the confluence of these two factors. But under these circumstances, Chimalpahin took as his task the transposition of pre-Hispanic Mesoamerican history, passed down through oral histories and in painted and written manuscripts, into alphabetic prose. Chimalpahin wrote almost entirely in Nahuatl, two notable exceptions being his Spanish adaptation of Hernando de Alvarado Tesosomoc's Mexican Chronicle and his amended copy of Francisco López de Gómara's History of the Conquest of Mexico. In the evolution of written as well as spoken Nahuatl, Chimalpahin occupies stage 2 of James Lockhart's 4-stage model of colonial Nahuatl. According to Lockhart, stage 2 Nahuatl, occurring between 1540 and 1650, is characterized by the incorporation of Spanish nouns as loanwords into an otherwise Nahuatl grammar. After all, Chimalpahin was multilingual. While Nahuatl was his first language, he also read, wrote, and spoke in Spanish with facility. While recent scholarship has elucidated important details surrounding Chimalpahin's life and work as a cultural mediator between Spanish and Nahua societies in Mexico's diverse ethnic and racial milieu, there has been less attention to Chimalpahin's use of Spanish loanwords as part of a rhetorical strategy. And it is to this aspect of Chimalpahin's work that I now turn. I just want to say that I became interested in the idea of justice in Chimalpahin's work years ago during my doctoral studies. As I read through Chimalpahin's corpus, I was intrigued by how much Chimalpahin, as a colonial historian, as a colonial era historian, focused on the status of indigenous noblewomen in Amacameca and the rights of their descendants to hold political office based on matrilineal descent. In his collection of works posthumously titled Las Ocho Relaciones, or the 8 Relations, Chimalpahin advocates for the legitimacy of matrilineal rulerly descent in the face of the colonial administration's insistence on patrilineal rulerly descent. A key concept in Chimalpahin's argument is justicia, which he uses frequently as a loanword across his various writings. The term justicia joins a constellation of Spanish terms related to government, including the term gobierno itself, that Chimalpahin folds into his Nahuatl prose, even manipulating these Spanish terms to fit within the structures of Nahuatl grammar. Along with Professor Teresa Satterfield, a linguistics professor at the University of Michigan, I undertook to tabulate and analyze the occurrence of justicia, juez, and oidor in Chimalpahin's collected works as evidence of his linguistic innovation within stage 2 Nahuatl, and in the context of what Brian Owensby calls the empire of law that had taken hold in Mexico by the early 17th century. Barbara Mundy has recently pointed out to me that the Nahuatl text in the hybrid documents created by the Cabildo of Mexico Tenochtitlan between 1553 and 1572 also contains justicia as a loanword, signaling an unresolved integration of the concept within Nahua society. It appears that this situation still held true for Chimalpahin in the early 17th century. In the years between the production of the hybrid documents of the Cabildo of Mexico Tenochtitlan and the time in which Chimalpahin produced his own written manuscripts, the colonial administration of New Spain had established a special court called the General Indian Court, dedicated to adjudicating the complaints of indigenous people. Chimalpahin's use of justicia as a loanword and his efforts to translate this concept across Spanish and Nahuatl signals an acute awareness of the development of this burgeoning legal apparatus and the need for indigenous people to understand it and the broader system of government implemented by the Spanish state. Indeed, in the last of his 8 relations, Chimalpahin implores a prospective indigenous audience to join him in a project of intercultural comparison, stating, quote, "And to verify all that has been said here, let us indigenous people, the Nahuatl of New Spain, bring together and consider examples, machillo. In this way, we will understand the governing customs, Intercultural, and laws, Nahuatl, followed by our senior brethren in the faith, especially those of highest rank, the revered kings and emperors who have come to govern and who govern now there in Spain. Thus, we will understand the ways of knowing, Imnemachti, and their governing laws, Nahuatl, this so-called law that they follow and govern themselves by." An important element of this imploration is Chimalpahin's use of Spanish loanwords alongside analog words in Nahuatl. In the Nahuatl text here, I have highlighted the Nahuatl term tlatoque, rulers, alongside reyes and emperadores, and the agglutinative Nahuatl phrase in tlatoca nenahuatlitzi, their governing laws, alongside the Spanish term for law, which is ley. From one perspective, these Spanish loanwords appear as supplement to the Nahuatl text. Yet from another perspective, the Nahuatl text itself serves as a long-form explanation of Spanish principles of governance. Chimalpahin's use of the Spanish term justicia operates in a similar fashion, with Chimalpahin offering analog Spanish Nahuatl terms, When describing the government of Chalco in the 15th century, prior to the arrival of the Spaniards, Chimalpahin draws on both Nahuatl and Spanish terms to describe the administration of rulerly justice. He states that the aforementioned rulers were Gentiles or pagans, but with their sovereign government, they held much authority over their vassals, in Macehualwan, whom they governed and provided stewardship over their subjects from Zacuatitlan, Tenanco, Chiconcohuac. In other words, in their hands was the power to condemn to death. They had a jail where they locked up criminals, and they ensured the proper administration of justice over their subjects from Tenanco, end quote. In this passage, I have highlighted the Nahuatl agglutinative phrase, Miquilis tetlatzo son tequilisli, or death sentence, as Chimalpahin's analog for the Spanish term for justice. Chimalpahin provides a similar juxtaposition in the following passage, which also focuses on pre-Hispanic governance in Chalco and specifically in Zacuatitlan, Tenanco. Quote, "And although the city of Zacuatitlan, Tenanco had a principal ward, it was 2 rulers who took charge of the local government, and both passed sentences as they administered justice." What is significant in both of these examples is the Spanish term for justice to describe pre-Hispanic rulership in the Chalco region. Chimalpahin's Nahuatl analog for justice in both of these cases is the composite phrase tzonteki, consisting of the noun tzontli and the verb teki, tzontli meaning hair and teki meaning to cut. In his seminal study of pre-Hispanic Aztec law, Jerome Offner states that tzonteki literally means cuts the hair or top, or the head. And Offner understands this phrase metaphorically as, quote, cutting the head off a case in rendering judgment and passing sentence, end quote. Yet, if there appears to be an overlap between the violence suggested in the passages that I have cited from Chimalpahin's 8 relations and the more general idea of passing sentences, it is because the phrase tzonteki does imply the literal exercise of capital punishment. The act of decapitation specifically has strong religious and military connotations in the period of Mexica rule in pre-Hispanic Mexico. Ruben G. Mendoza notes that for the Mexica and the Maya, decapitation, quote, constituted the primordial first act of creation and human sacrifice that took place within the hallowed grounds of the Totlachco, or place of ballgame sacrifice, end quote. In the colonial period, the inclusion of the suffix tla to the term tzonteki, to the verb tzonteki, qualifies the Nahuatl meaning of decapitation, extending the object of cutting to things beyond a person's hair or head. In other words, a more generalized exercise of force, or conversely, the idea of cutting the head of a case as proposed by Offner. Thus, in the colonial period, tlatzonteki came to be associated with the Spanish, with the sentencing or judgment, without the necessary implication of capital punishment. And this definition of tlatzonteki is offered by Alonso de Molina, one of the creators of a Spanish grammar in the 16th century, in 16th century Mexico. And so in the passage that I have cited, Chimalpahin places particular emphasis on the violence of justice by attaching the term mikisli, meaning death, to tzonteki, to produce the phrase mikiliste tlatzontekilisli. And that would be this term right here, highlighted in yellow. Chimalpahin's focus on the violence of justice is in keeping with the classical understanding of this term. Jason Boatwright argues that the Latin term for justice, justitia, means the embodiment of jus, whose various etymologies he associates with the idea of restriction. Boatwright states that if jus came from words meaning command, fear, and violence, it would be about forcing someone to do something he wouldn't otherwise do. If jus came from words denoting a distribution of rights and remedies, it would be about who gets them and who doesn't get them. If jus were descended from words signifying obligation, it would be about the restriction on freedom. And if jus meant life, it would be about limitations imposed on living. Under all the four competing etymologies, jus is the notion that rights, justice, in the sense of what is just, and laws limit what people can do, end quote. For Chimalpahin and other thinkers in the early modern Hispanic world, this idea of justice as violent and restrictive was central to the concept of good governance, which in Spanish was understood as policía. When Chimalpahin writes of the exercise of justice by pre-Hispanic governors in Chalco, he does so in a way that is in keeping with Spanish concepts of justicia and policía. Chimalpahin's juxtaposition of Spanish and Nahua concepts of justice served to legitimize Indigenous forms of government while providing a prospective Indigenous readership with the kinds of examples, or machillot, that he calls for at the end of his 8 relations. Chimalpahin's project of intercultural translation both proceeds and diverges from that of a prior generation of scribes and painters, Nahua scribes and painters. And here I'm talking about the noble Nahua students of Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan priest who from the 1530s to the 1570s supervised the creation of a wide-ranging 12-volume encyclopedia of pre-Hispanic Nahua and specifically Mexica society. Sahagún titled this encyclopedia The General History of the Things of New Spain, also known today as the Florentine Codex. The format of the 12 volumes of the Florentine Codex consists of Nahuatl text on the left-hand side of the page, a loose Spanish interpretation of the Nahuatl text on the right-hand side of the page, and small drawings interspersed within the text, usually in the Spanish portion. Though the Florentine Codex was confiscated and sent to Europe in 1578, so a year before Chimalpahin's birth, Chimalpahin nonetheless knew of Sahagún's work. Indeed, Chimalpahin copied a manuscript attributed to Sahagún, the Ejercicio Cotidiano, or daily exercise, though the original document was likely produced by one of Sahagún's indigenous students. In Lockhart's 4-stage model of colonial written Nahuatl, the Florentine Codex occupies the first stage, generally issuing Spanish loanwords and other Spanish intrusions. And generally, it was left to Sahagún to interpret the Spanish text based on his extensive study of Nahua and his collaboration with his indigenous students. Yet the Florentine Codex was not meant for an indigenous audience, but would rather serve as an ethnographic guide for Christian missionaries. If the Florentine Codex preserved pre-Hispanic Nahua manners of speaking, it was in order to provide missionaries with an unfiltered view, to the extent that that was even possible, onto Native society, and particularly pre-Hispanic Native society. And yet, the descriptions of judicial authority in the Florentine Codex do resonate with Chimalpahin's exposition of justice in his own writings. This image from Book 8 of the Florentine Codex depicts a somber Teclatuani, translated by Sahagún as a judge or a magistrate, consulting a painting while listening to the testimony of an official or accuser, whose speech is manifested through a floating speech scroll. The official or accuser stands over the person being accused, speaking down towards him in an aggressive stance and with an aggressive stance and hand gesture. These domineering qualities contrast with the stoic countenance of the Teclatuani, whose head tilts downward towards the painting. The particular objects in the painting, a cup, a turquoise necklace, and a wooden club, only hints at a potential narrative, perhaps the robbery of luxury items with the use of a club. Metonymically, the paintings stand for truth, which the Teclatuani seeks to ascertain. Altogether, the different parts of the image emphasize the activity of the Teclatoque judges in the Tecali, or lordly house, while the Xihuitzoli, or turquoise diadem, pictographic representation of Mexica sovereignty, floating above the Teclatuani's head, as well as above the Tecali. Well, we see this diadem, a turquoise diadem, above the Teclatuani's head and above the courthouse, or the Tecali. And this reinforces the idea of judicial power that underlines the activity occurring in the scene. In this way, material and symbolic accoutrements complement one another. Likewise, the descriptions of the Teclatoque in Book 8 reinforce their connection to sovereignty, and in particular, the sovereignty of the Tlatoani, or ruler. The preeminence of the Tlatoani punctuates the following description of proper and improper behaviors of the Teclatoque, or judges. Quote, "The wise, the able, the sage, who listened and spoke well, who were of good memory, who spoke not vainly nor lightly, who did not make friends without forethought nor were drunkards, who guarded their lineage with honor, who slept not overmuch, but rather arose early, who did nothing for friendship's or kinship's sake, nor for enmity, who would not hear nor judge a case for a fee. The ruler might condemn them to death, the judges. Hence they performed their offices as judges righteously, for otherwise these judges could find excuse for the wrongs which they might do." End quote. Thus, while the Teclatoque participate in the Tlatoani sovereignty, the Tlatoani holds ultimate power over the sovereign decision and, above all, the right to kill, even to kill judges. Indeed, the Nahua word for passing judgment on someone again is kitzonteki, which is used in the passage above just as Chimalpahin uses it, and implies capital punishment. The right to condemn someone to death finds emphasis in pictorial images accompanying the discussion of the Teclatoque in the Florentine Codex. So we see here illustrations of executions by one image of execution by strangulation before a judge. The subject being executed wears garb similar to that of his executioners, possibly indicating his own status as an official. And this is the image to the left. Meanwhile, in the image to the right, what is depicted is the incarceration and execution of an erring musician. Here, the execution is carried out with the use of a makwawit, a weapon consisting of a long piece of wood lined with obsidian blades. Both images depict execution in dramatic fashion. The one image presents the executed subject with his mouth agape. The image to the left presents the executed subject with his mouth agape, perhaps taking his last breath. The Teclatoque, or Tlatoani, they are indistinguishable visually as they don the same clothing, presides over the scene with a stern visage. He sits on a woven reed throne, while a turquoise diadem floats above his own head. One official directs the execution, while two others actively pull on the cord wrapped around the perpetrator's neck. The strained bodies of the executioners stress their effort. And in the scene to the right, we see that tears stream down the musician's face, both in captivity and during his execution, lending an emotional charge to the scene. The executioner holds his makwawi over the victim's head, blood already gushing out, as if pulling away or getting ready for another blow. Both images thus add subtle visual cues that heighten the gravity of execution. The execution of the musician in particular highlights not so much the capriciousness of the ruler as an economy of sovereignty. Dance and song were critical elements that the Tlatoani would invoke as a galvanizing spectacle for his subjects, nobles and commoners alike. Indeed, the scenes of execution in Book 8, even in their extremely truncated form, make reference to a larger apparatus of sovereignty, consisting of rigorous codes of conduct. The Tlatoque too are beholden to these codes, all the more so since they serve as proxies of the Tlatoani. In Chimalpahin's exposition of colonial governance in Amacameca, he appears to hold the colonial government to the standards of judicial authority described in the Florentine Codex. In his eighth relation, Chimalpahin reserves his most pointed critiques for an indigenous judge, Andrés de Santiago Xochitl, whom the Viceroy of New Spain, Antonio de Mendoza, sent to Chalco and Amacameca in 1546 and 1547 to resolve a number of disputes over rulerly succession that had roiled the local indigenous government. In Chimalpahin's account, those disputes were the result of successive imperial conquests of Chalco and Amacameca, first by the Mexica in the 15th century, and then by the Spaniards in the 16th century. According to Chimalpahin, Xochitl was to investigate the rulerly lineages of Amacameca. Chimalpahin later explains that a group of community leaders kept track of these lineages in their books, perhaps painted and perhaps alphabetical, which Xochitl consulted during his residence in Chalco Amacameca. Yet upon consulting the books, Xochitl rejected the claim of one governor, Jose de Santa Maria Teclacosaucatzi, over his post on the basis that only his mother had noble blood, while his father was a mere masewal, or commoner. This ruling by the judge met resistance from Amacameca's elites and the community at large, causing the judge to begrudgingly reinstate the governor. This series of events leads Chimalpahin to lament Xochitl inadequate investigation of the situation in Chalco Amacameca, as presented to him by the elders of the province. And Chimalpahin states that the elders really were not prone to lying, that they told the truth. According to Chimalpahin, quote, although the judge Andrés de Santiago Xochitl was knowledgeable about our customs, something lacked in his understanding, because if he had really extended his knowledge of the situation, he would not have rejected or put in doubt the legitimate birth of Don Jose de Santa Maria Tlamoacatecli, which is another name for the same governor that I had referred to previously, simply on the basis that he was descended from nobility through maternal lineage, which is what the judge precisely did, end quote. To close this presentation and to summarize, I argue that Chimalpahin deploys the concept of justicia as an act of intercultural translation. This operation works both ways, adjusting Nahuatl to Spanish rule while also Nahuatlizing Spanish terms, sensing the disintegration of indigenous governance, exemplified in the disputes in Amacameca in the 1540s. Chimalpahin places justice at the center of his linguistic innovation as a means of cultural and political preservation. Yet, in using the loan word justicia, Chimalpahin cannot help but recall the memory of pre-Hispanic rulership, so much so that he gives extensive attention to the exceptional case of two women who once governed in Amacameca. That memory relies on the twin concepts of noble lineage and the sovereign exercise of capital punishment, or justicia. Ultimately, Chimalpahin presents his Nahuatl and Spanish idea of justicia as a hypercorrection, effectively turning the concept of justice back on the colonial apparatus. It is now Chimalpahin who scrutinizes the colonial judge, just as the colonial judge had scrutinized, albeit incorrectly, the noble lineages of Amacameca, rescinding one of them. Perhaps in posterity, Chimalpahin had hoped for a turn in the concept of justice toward restitution and as autonomy and governance for the benefit of indigenous polities like Chalco Amacameca. Thank you.
Wonderful, Martín. Thank you so much. This has been just so fascinating as a conversation thinking about this multifaceted act of translation and the resonance of all of these different words. Jerome Offner has put a comment in for the two that I'm not sure everybody can see, but he says, regarding Sonteki, actual decapitation in pre-contact jurisprudence was rare. That was actually something I was finding myself thinking a lot about too. Because we know that there's decapitation as part of ritual that ends up on a tombantli, but I'd never really thought about it in the sense of justice. Okay, back to Jerry's comments. Strangulation and smashing between two stones were more common. I think the difficulty of reaching a good sentence of practicing good jurisprudence is also included in the meaning. Tontli is a bundle of grass, something complicated, something that needs sorting out, and then he concludes by saying, thanks for working on pre-contact law. Martín, is there anything you'd like to say in response to that?
Yeah, as I was looking over the possible meanings of Sonteki, I was thinking about these other meanings of Tsontli, or these multifaceted meanings of Tsontli, and so it becomes a little bit harder to say that it's definitively cutting the hair or cutting the head, because it also does signify like a bundle of grass, which in pictographic form also symbolizes 400, the amount of 400 things like tribute items. And so it could have also, as Dr. Offner has suggested, it could also mean an ordering. And so that adds another layer of meaning, right? To not just sort of cutting the head off a case, which is what Offner proposes, but maybe like ordering, putting things in order, which also would have resonated very much with the idea of policía in the early modern Hispanic world. Policía being the idea of good government, good governance, good government, which entailed the idea of order. And that really, in this context, the idea of disorder was really anathema to the Spanish state.
Okay, I've got a follow-up question from Jerome Offner, and then I see that questions are coming in. Thank you so much. Keep them coming. So he follows up and says, do you see Sonteki ever used in the context of a civil case? What is the word for a decision in a civil case?
Well, if we consider, I mainly focus on Chimalpahin's histories. So in that sense, I read for the situations that Chimalpahin describes. So I can say that Chimalpahin's descriptions of legal processes and judicial intervention in Amacameca is, what is the word that Dr. Offner is using again?
He hasn't given us the term. Jerry, if you want to throw it into the chat, we can see what, or into the Q&A, we can see what we want to do with it. In the meantime, I want to move on to a question by Barbara Mundy, who says, wonderful talk, Martín. Do you have a sense of informal justice that might be happening beyond the lettered world of law, and where Chimalpahin might set informal justice within his framework of justicia?
I think so. Again, this kind of goes back to what I was trying to articulate in response to Dr. Offner, which is I'm reading Chimalpahin's recollection of legal disputes over governing jurisdiction in Chalco Amacameca. So to what extent they align with actual conditions on the ground, it's hard to tell. And it's hard to tell because as far as I know, there are not many, as far as I know, there aren't other documents relating the same cases that Chimalpahin is discussing, save for, there is a document in the Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico that does discuss a bit the status of the heirs of the people that Chimalpahin is discussing in his histories. But in Chimalpahin's histories, it does appear that the community itself overturns the decision of the judge who's sent by the viceroy. So the indigenous people, as Chimalpahin narrates, revolted against the judge's decision to disallow one indigenous governor based on his matrilineal descent. The other indigenous nobles went to the judge and said, well, the people won't follow us, they won't obey us if this person is not in power. And so if the people don't obey us, who's going to wash our mouths? Who is going to bring us wood? And this convinces the judge, or helps to convince the judge to reinstate the governor who only had governing lineage through matrilineal descent. And so that's an example of another kind of justicia, more community-based justicia. I think Chimalpahin even implies the idea of election, sort of popular referendum, kind of that idea on the part of the Masehualtin, or the vassals or the subjects.
Wonderful to have an example where the community overturns the justice or the justicia, accomplished by the representatives of the Spanish crown. That's really delightful. For the moment, I'm going to move on to an anonymous question that says, should the turquoise diadem depicted above the Quauhtlehuani's head be taken merely as a visual symbolism for their judicial authority, or taken literally as a piece of garb worn by them? In most depictions of the diadem as worn by an actual Quauhtlehuani, it's being shown directly on the head rather than floating above. I was actually really struck by that imagery too. And I wonder if you have any thought about that, or about sort of what Tecuhtlahtolani is, as a phrase, is doing.
Right. So Tecuhtlahtolani is a modification of the term Tlahtlani. So in these Nahua terms, it's almost like saying deputy ruler, like deputy governor. But in the translation to Spanish, Sahagún and Chimalpahin alike translate Tecuhtlahtolani as judge or senator or magistrate. At the same time, I think it's important to Boatwright, for example, distinguishes between the idea of judge and the idea of justice. The idea of justice, or the personification of Deus, ultimately holds sovereign authority, while he makes the decision, or she makes the decision, while judges interpret. And so in this case, I interpret the floating diadem as sort of that distinction between the sovereign who makes a decision, including the sovereign right to kill, and the judge who works under the authority of the Tlahtlani. So the Teclatoque, the judges working under the ruler. And so that's why I think that the diadem is not actually placed on the person's head, because this is not actually a Tlahtlani of Mezcotenochtitlan, but a judge. Same thing.
I think it's also wonderful, as I'm looking, that they don't have the speech scroll, which we often see in the representation of Tlahtlani, to speak about that, or to represent that act of speaking that is part of what the name is. Fascinating. Okay, next question from Den Borges. Does Justicia explain only immediate first instance judicial context, or is Justicia invoked to explain appeals to higher courts and ultimately to the king?
That's a good question. I think it was a term that Chimalpahin understood to be central to appealing to ultimate Spanish authority, even though indigenous people like Chimalpahin would likely not have had direct access to the Spanish king. The most they could hope for is access to the viceroy. And so I do think the idea of justice held out, or it expressed an ideal that an Indigenous person like Chimalpahin could sort of throw back in the face of sovereign authority, as if to say that the colonial administration should be living up to this ideal, this ultimate governing ideal.
Wonderful. Francois Paré says, I work primarily on colonial French writing in the Great Lakes area in basically the same period discussed here. The concept of justice does not seem to be present in the 17th century colonial French context. I cannot recall one text that would allude to this context. How specific is this issue to the Spanish colonial texts?
That's a good question too, and I think that calls for a comparative analysis like the one that this person asking the question is referring to. In one sense, the idea of justice might be a term that resonated, right, with Nahua conceptions of governance. We do see that Chimalpahin has a wide-ranging vocabulary that he can use to mirror Spanish ideas of justice and governance. But we might say that there's also something particular about the Spanish state, and that the Spanish state perhaps was uniquely focused on, or was uniquely legalistic. I think that's what some scholars would argue and have argued. Scholars have pointed to the codification of Spanish customs and laws that were also called fueros in medieval Spain. The codification of these laws in a compendium called the Siete Partidas, that were compiled under by order of Alfonso the Wise. And so that's a particular historical development that also grew out of the conflict between Spain and or Christian Spain and Muslim Spain, or Muslim kingdoms in the Spanish Peninsula. So that's just a very specific situation that sort of gave rise to a legalistic culture, let's say. And so there's scholarship coming out now on the idea of law as culture. And so there has been literature on the idea of Spanish literature emerging out of legalistic culture. So again, this might be particular to Spain and its reception of Latin tradition, Roman Latin tradition.
Wonderful. We have just about 1 minute remaining. So let me go back. There was one other one to circle around perhaps to a question that we had at the beginning. Richard Tan writes in the discussion about this question of what it is that Zonteki might mean. Richard Tan writes, in a verbal embed where you have a noun added to a verb, the noun virtually never functions as a direct object. So it can't be the cut or teki, the zontli, the head or the hair. Anders and also Sullivan describe it as functioning adverbially. So it's the cut in a zontli-like way, whatever the heck that means. And that was me, that was not Richard. Richard says, I'm more inclined to read zonteki as arranging as one would a zontli or a set of 400. So I don't know, Martín, do you want to respond to that? And then I will wrap up very quickly.
I like the multiplicity of meanings, and I think the idea of ordering makes a lot of sense. And as I was embarking on this talk and really reviewing what I had done, I was left a little unsatisfied with the idea of Zonteki that I had previously. So this actually helps a lot.
I love the idea of polyvalence here, and I also wonder whether it might be helpful to look and think about what cognate concepts one could find in Maya or in other indigenous languages.
That would be
and whether that would help with the question of separating out these different meanings. Although I mean, I think that one of the real glories of Nahuatl is how polysemic it can be in so many different times and moments.
Yeah, and I think there was a point made that you know, how often did capital punishment actually occur? Was it more of a sort of a rhetorical gesture, even in both in text form and in visual form? Is it more of a symbol?
Great. There's a request in the chat then to also summarize this conversation that we had in Spanish, and it was basically about the idea that there are three different legal regimes operating in New Spain in the 16th century. There's the civil law, there's what's called the República de los Indios, which is a series of laws that apply to indigenous people, but not to Spaniards. And then there's the question of canonical or church law. And so thinking about how Justicia might interact at the intersection of all of these three, and then also thinking about the ethical obligations to living indigenous communities, of thinking about Justicia and understanding what pre-Hispanic concepts of Justicia might be like. Martín, is there anything you want to add to that summary?
I think it would be helpful to actually do ethnographic work and to see what these terms might mean in indigenous communities in the present day, particularly with like the positive documents since the 17th century, although it's worth always, of course, looking for more documentation. But I am reminded of a case. I remember when I was studying Nahuatl with a friend, with indigenous Nahuatl speakers, and Eduardo de la Cruz, who many of you all know, while he was teaching that course, he was also working as a sort of a contract interpreter for a Nahua person who was caught in the legal system, I think in Florida. And this Nahua person could not grasp this idea of law. And it just reflects different situations, right? Coming from different situations where this idea, Spanish idea, didn't really have use, let's say. So that's just the case in point.
What a perfect place to end. I found myself thinking a lot over the course of this talk about the disjunctions between perhaps the rhetoric of Justicia and the way that things are happening on the ground in New Spain. And then also inexorably of the difference between the rhetoric of legal frameworks that we have now and the experiences that people are having on the ground. So thank you so much, Martín, and thank you to all the participants but thank you especially, Martín, for such a stimulating presentation and for such a thoughtful discussion of all of the issues that arise from our obligation to consider Justicia in all of its different forms. Thank you all so much for joining us today.